South Africa has approached the International Court of Justice for an urgent request for additional measures in Gaza. Now, South Africa says there's been a significant development in the situation in Gaza, which requires the court's attention. This comes as there are growing concerns about the military offensive in Rafah. Let's now speak to Unisa International Law Professor Thomashausen. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time. Let's just start with, just the significance of this latest bid by South Africa.
Well, Bongiwe and viewers, of course, South Africa continues to try and become the conscience, the good conscience of the world. So they have asked the court for more help. The court has already adopted interim measures to secure that no acts of genocide must happen in this confrontation and in this attempt of Israel to fend off the attack by Hamas and to actually free the hostages. In that, I think the application of South Africa now, the renewed application, is overlooking that there is a long precedent, many decades of practice, that when an aeroplane gets hijacked and the passengers are taken hostages by some marginal group who are extremists and who want to force their will on the world, that then there is no giving in to those hostage takers. There is no giving in to the hijackers. And Israel takes the same view, the same approach. As long as the hostages have not been freed, there cannot be a cessation of the use of force. And actually, the head of the Palestine Authority, Mr. Abbas, has just now appealed to Hamas to finally release the remaining hostages, alive or dead.
And now, Prof, looking at what South Africa is asking for, and given the situation in Rafah at the moment, South Africa arguing that a large-scale military assault in the area would exponentially increase what it is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. That is what South Africa is arguing. So let's look at these particular measures that then it's asking for. Do they go far enough?
Well, the court is in a predicament. Of course, these 15 judges, 15 plus 2 judges, cannot change anything on the ground in Gaza, and they haven't saved a single life in Gaza thus far. So they might decide to make another measure, another appeal, but it's only that, it's an appeal. Like in all the grave and serious conflicts that we are currently experiencing. In Sudan, there are 4 million people facing starvation, and they don't even have water. And they live in actually much more terrible conditions than anyone in Gaza now. In Ukraine, there are 700,000 dead, and the ICJ has not been able to prevent that. So the ICJ will try its best. It will understand South Africa's concern, but the real change on the ground in Gaza can only come from the current negotiations for the next ceasefire round and the release of the hostages.
So then, Prof, listening to what you're saying, and you are in international law, so what role then does international law, particularly the Genocide Convention, then play in South Africa's appeal to the ICJ right now, and especially when you contextualize it in what is happening in Gaza, in Rafah?
Well, there's a significant number of scholars that would actually say that international law is not really law because there is no enforcement. There is no ways that an international court can enforce anything. It can only appeal to the good sense, to the common spirit of nations, and hope that its authority and making findings about what should happen and what shouldn't happen, about what is right and what is not right, that will inspire, will inform the conduct of governments. The difficulty here is that the major powers of the world, most of them BRICS members, China, Russia, India, now also Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Egypt and Brazil, of course, and joined by the United States, they are not taking any decisive action. They accept that the hostages have to be freed so as not to break the principle that we do not give in to kidnappers, we do not give in to hostage takers.
So, Prof, then going back to your earlier statement then that there are some who are saying that international law is not law because it cannot be enforced, then one then asks the question, is it all window dressing?
No, it's not window dressing. It is exchanging very important insights, views, judgments. Respected judges, respected people will form their opinion and will make their findings, and it can have a deep psychological influence if a country is found to be wrong. The liberation of South Africa from apartheid was an experience in that regard, but it took decades. It took decades for the world to accept it is legally and morally wrong to deprive some 80% of your population from the right to vote, for instance. So you cannot expect immediate solutions from these international courts, unfortunately.
So I suppose then it's the long game as the situation then continues to escalate on the ground. So given the widespread condemnation, in your view, that we've seen directed at Israel over the escalation in the situation in Rafah at the moment and the protests that we've seen in that regard, do you think this is likely to gain momentum? As you say, the law is one aspect of it, but there's also, of course, the reality on the ground as well.
Well, the reality on the ground, we hear from the Israeli ambassador in London just 3 hours ago in a public interview with Sky News that Israel will not commence military operations until the civilian population has been given a fair opportunity to evacuate, to get out of harm's way. The argument of Israel is that the only place where the hostages can now be is in the tunnel network under Rafah. And this tunnel network is also housing some 3 or even 4 battalions, 4,000 very highly trained and armed Hamas fighters, and that this has to be resolved. So I doubt very much that Israel would risk a large bloodshed. There will be some casualties, but there will definitely not be a humanitarian catastrophe as we have seen it in Ukraine or in Sudan.
And then, Prof, I wonder then, what do they report back to the court? Because they are supposed to go back in about a month's time. And I suppose now one could, calculate it as possibly 11 days left. So what then do they report back to the court, given what we've seen happening in Rafah and what has been the situation on the ground now?
Well, I think it's very predictable. Israel will file a report explaining that not a single act of genocide has happened because there's no genocidal intent, because Israel never intended to eliminate the population of Gaza. They could have done that in 1 hour with 1 nuclear bomb, for instance. And they will argue that they haven't done that. They have used their right of self-defense. There have been casualties. There have been collateral damage, as the military call it, but they were not intentional. So, and people who have exceeded their orders and acted wrongfully, Israel will explain, will face consequences from that. And of course, South Africa will have the opportunity to argue with the facts that they have in their possession. But I doubt very much that the ICJ will make a finding that an act of genocide was committed.